All right, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a tragic event from 1904 that literally revolutionized criminal investigations. We often take modern forensics for granted, stuff like DNA testing, digital footprints, chemical analysis. But there was a time when crime scenes were taken entirely at face value. We're going to walk through the Mabel Page murder case, a true crime story that completely shocked the nation and forever changed how detectives approach a suspicious death. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the evidence, we really have to ask ourselves, how exactly did a staged suicide in a quiet 1904 town change forensics forever? Imagine being a detective over a century ago. You walk into a room and you see what looks like a perfectly tragic, self-inflicted end. The leap from just accepting what your eyes immediately see to actually questioning the staging of a room was a massive paradigm shift. In this case, it's the absolute blueprint for that shift.
Part 1. A quiet town shattered.
Picture this. We're in the idyllic town of Weston, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. It's the spring of 1904. This is the kind of place where families lived peacefully, doors were probably left unlocked, and violent crime was, well, practically a foreign concept. Among these highly respected residents was the Page family. They lived a quiet life with their daughter Mabel, who was known all throughout the community as a kind, educated young woman. It was the absolute last place anyone expected a brutal crime to happen.
March 31st started off like a perfectly normal day before taking a turn into absolute tragedy. In the morning, Mabel just followed her exact normal routine at home. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, midday, a man named Charles Tucker is spotted lingering near the Page residence. Fast forward just a few hours to the afternoon, and her relatives return to the house to make a discovery that would haunt this town forever. Which brings us to part 2, suicide or staged. So the investigators arrive on the scene, and right there, near Mabel's body, they find a handwritten note. And this note points directly, unequivocally, to suicide. Now, at first glance, early 20th century investigators believed this note told the whole story. I mean, it's an open and shut case, right? You have a tragic death and a note explaining it. But something in that room just didn't feel right to those looking closely. When you compare the claims made in that letter against the actual injuries on Mabel's body, there was a massive disconnect. On one hand, the letter laid out a very specific narrative of self-harm, but the physical trauma found on her body simply did not match the events described on that piece of paper. The narrative and the physical reality were in complete opposition. It was like a giant puzzle where the pieces were being forced into the wrong spots. Enter medical examiner Dr. Julian Mead. He steps in, carefully examines the body, and reaches what was, at the time, an absolutely shocking conclusion. It was murder. He realized the suicide note was entirely staged to mislead the police. This was huge. Dr. Mead deduced that Mabel had been killed, and the perpetrator deliberately tried to manipulate the crime scene to cover their tracks. That realization blew the case wide open. Part 3. Catching Charles Tucker. Now dealing with a confirmed murder, detectives cast an enormous net, kicking off one of the biggest investigations Massachusetts had ever seen. They systematically tore through the house searching for microscopic clues. They interviewed the entire community, knocking on doors for eyewitness accounts, and they rigorously questioned absolutely everyone who had visited or had access to the home that day. They were turning over every single stone. Through these intense, exhaustive interviews, one name kept popping up over and over again: Charles Tucker. He was a local laundry delivery driver. Now, that meant he had a perfectly normal, legitimate reason to be traveling through the neighborhoods of Weston. But investigators had to wonder, was his presence near the Page home just a coincidence, or was it something far more sinister? As they dug deeper during the interrogation phase, Tucker's stories started getting inconsistent, and his alibi completely fell apart. First, multiple witnesses report seeing him near the house right around the time of the murder. Then, when detectives bring him in, his alibi changes several times under questioning. That's a massive red flag. And finally, forensic experts discover physical evidence connecting him straight to the crime scene. The net had officially closed. Moving on to part 4, the circumstantial trial. You guys, it is really hard to overstate just how massive this trial became. Tucker's arrest sparked an absolute media frenzy. We're talking enormous nationwide newspaper coverage. The American public was entirely captivated, just eagerly devouring every single detail. It literally had all the elements of a gripping novel: a quiet town, a staged suicide, a brilliant medical examiner, and a delivery driver standing accused. When it got to court, The core battle lines were clearly drawn. The prosecution argued that Tucker attacked Mabel while making his deliveries and then calculatingly staged the suicide scene to throw off the police. The defense, however, hammered home a very strong argument for 1904. There were absolutely no direct eyewitnesses to the crime. Because of that, they argued the evidence connecting Tucker was entirely circumstantial. It was really a battle of the old way of looking at crimes versus the new scientific reality. Could you condemn a man without an eyewitness? After weeks of gripping testimony, the jury's decision was final. They decided that yes, the physical and circumstantial evidence was undeniable. Charles Tucker was found guilty of first-degree murder. But the fight actually didn't end in that courtroom. Tucker and his legal team launched relentless efforts, appealing the conviction all the way up to the Supreme Court. However, that forensic foundation laid by the prosecution, it held strong. Every single appeal failed, the verdict was upheld, and Charles Tucker was ultimately executed for the murder.
And finally, Part 5, a forensic legacy.
So why does a single murder from 1904 still matter to us today? Well, it remains one of the most famous cases in Massachusetts history because it fundamentally changed the way police investigate suspicious deaths. It proved, once and for all, that careful forensic examination can expose a meticulously staged crime. It taught us that you simply cannot take a crime scene at face value anymore. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this chilling and really powerful reminder. The smallest clue is enough to uncover the biggest lie. The Mabel Page case showed us that the truth is often hiding right there in the physical details, waiting for someone observant enough to piece it together. It makes you wonder, when looking at the complex mysteries of our modern world, what tiny clues are currently sitting in plain sight, just waiting to unravel the next massive lie? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.